And let me just again. Okay. This is a shot here. Okay, so we're on 114, all the way to the right, the bottom. It says defilement contracted via seminal discharges. So let's just read the first two verses, then we could talk a little bit about the general idea, because this is launching a general conversation. Man from whom there issues a discharge of semen must first immerse all his flesh in the water of a mikveh, after which he will remain defiled until evening, at which time he will become rid of this defilement. This applies equally to all discharges of semen, whether permitted, meaning by which a person inseminates his wife through marital relations, or forbidden, all of the types, whether voluntary or involuntary. Any garment or any leather article that has semen on it must be immersed in the waters of mikveh, after which it will remain defiled until evening, at which time it will become rid of this defilement. Okay, so actually, let's just do 18 on page 115. We can talk a little more about it and read. A woman with whom a man engages in carnal relations, whereby there has a discharge of semen, because she has it from him, becomes defiled just as does the man. They must therefore both immerse themselves in the water of a mikveh, after which they will remain defiled until evening, at which time they will become rid of this defilement. Okay, so there's a few things in the maybe call it subscripts or superscripts or meta messages that are going to be found in the Torah literature on this topic. In general, and first of all, the Torah does see any discharges from the body as being, well, first of all, something dischargeable. So it's like throwaway, it's a little lesser than. And that there's something, I want to use more mature words about it, but if you think about excrement or urine, there's nothing wrong with that. The person who dispels their waste, releases their waste, is happy about it. There's a blessing to be recited. Thank you, God, for that for helping our systems to work properly. So there's nothing wrong with it. There's certainly nothing morally wrong with it. Yet, first of all, in human nature, we don't do those in public. We do it on the side. There's something less than, at least in the way what we impute to it, less than dignified about it. And so first of all, in Torah thinking, the fact that society imputes a certain value, and I say value either high or low, to something, that also has import, because we're part of the society. It's how we see it. So later on in the Torah is going to say that when the Jews go out to war, one of the things is about maintaining their dignity is that they have to have, all the soldiers had to have a shovel. So when they had to relieve themselves, they could go to the side, they could cover it up. It was about their dignity. And the language is that, I mean, if maybe somewhat loosely translated, is that they're on the battlefield. On the battlefield, there shouldn't be something disgusting to us. Now, there's nothing disgusting inherently about excrement. It's just a bodily function, but we do see it that way. If it gets on us, it's we want to wash it off. It's icky, whatever. I mean, when we get past grade school, even there's something to it. And you're not allowed to daven. You're not allowed to pray in front of urine or excrement if it's in the room. It's not an evil thing. It's something that is less than respectable in the human mind, in our approach, and therefore we shouldn't be davening in front of it. There's that quote unquote the dirty angle to it now, and that even has import halachically. That generally goes for any human discharge, male or female. Something it seems something we keep very private. Now, when it comes to semen, and to some extent also a female discharge, but more in semen, that's associated with pleasure. Now, pleasure is not a bad thing, but pleasure can be a very selfish pleasure. And pleasure can be sometimes how we lose ourselves in the pursuit of pleasure, and losing ourselves means losing sight of our moral code because we're so engaged in the desire or in the experiencing of a sensual pleasure. So semen, well, semen it's also a natural discharge, and it is the stuff of life, and that's we're all born from that. Still in all, anytime there's a discharge of semen, it would seem that on a more spiritual level, since there's an attendant deep self-gratification, which isn't bad, but it could be more selfish, self-directed. There is a certain tinge to it that while again, if husband and wife being together and giving to each other has the outlet, semen is part of that. Everything's always there. Everything's good. It's all natural. No one did anything more immoral or morally wrong. On the contrary, there's something morally right. At the same time, since there is that tinge of that or at least that potential, and very often practically there is that tinge of this extreme self-gratification. It's seen as something that to deal with morally, to be able to address that so we can move forward in a way where we don't want to be so self-directed. We want to be more other directed on giving. So the in this we say that whenever there's a discharge of semen, not only is the man says that does the person consider not able to eat pure things, holy things, and that has to go to the mikveh, the woman does too, because she's part of that action, and she actually physically had the semen in her. So functionally, that since we no longer have a temple and we no longer have sacred foods and we have no longer the restrictions of purity and impurity, so just like we've spoken about when it comes to going to a cemetery. Good morning, Debbie. It's since that no longer applies, go to a cemetery. It's a mitzvah. You get that tinge of having interfaced with the dead, but which is a good thing, but there is that we walk away with. So, but in the olden days, that would mean there's somehow now an impediment, and restriction, something for me to deal with before I am able to go visit the temple, eat of sacred foods, and so on. That was functionally a difference. Today, there really isn't a difference. There's nothing functional. You come out of a cemetery or a funeral, you've done a great thing. We do wash our hands ritually, which is a vestige of that idea of the what we call tuma, that the purity and part of it, right, dealing with a corpse, and then you go about your business. You walk into a shul, you can daven, you do everything. Same thing goes here with this conversation I just had about this idea of the semen. Functionally, it doesn't make a difference anymore. What the Torah is saying here is that a person who cohabited last night, this morning, would have restrictions about they can't just walk into the temple. They can't just bring an offering. They can't just eat truma or whatever any sacred foods, because they have this impediment, because there is that vestige of as we discussed it. Now, so really functionally doesn't make a difference. However, if you want to take a look at text 18, a closer look, 18 on page 115. It says they must immerse themselves. The husband and the wife, man and woman, have to immerse themselves because of the contact with this semen. This immersion, like all those mentioned in this section of the Torah, is required in order to permit those who have become ritually defiled to consume sanctified food, truma or offerings, or enter the temple and its precincts. That's what, right? That person who cohabited, a couple cohabited last night, which would be a good thing, principle, because they're coming together, and the closeness of husband and wife is holy and very important to God and very important to us. This morning, say, okay, now we have to go to the mikveh, because we can't just go into the temple and precincts. If that was on our list of things to do, and if it was on our list of things to do, then probably last night wasn't enough to go happen. Today we don't have those complications. There was no temple. So nowadays, when we're all in any case ritually defiled by direct or indirect contact with corpses, we all have that. You go visit a cemetery, something for which the means or even in a funeral, you're in the same building with a corpse. The coffin's there. Contracted it. No, none of us can avoid it. For which the means of purification are not presently available, this law is not applicable. Since we're all in that state of ritual defilement, and we're not going to the temple, it really doesn't make a difference to us functionally. And therefore, neither men who have a ceremonial mission of any kind, nor women who engage in marital relations are technically required to immerse themselves in a mikveh. So in that sense, this is off the table in the purely halachic sense as the Torah presents it. Nonetheless, bringing it a little forward, Ezra the scribe, when the Jews after the Babylonians destroyed the temple, and it led most of the Jews into slavery in Babylonia. And Babylonia became a center of Jewish life. The Jews they grew, they flourished there. It became something like an America of its time, and that's where they were there for. There was a 70-year period. And towards the end of the 70-year period is where the whole Purim story happens, and we even have Jews in government and with the Jewish bride. Not that people knew she was Jewish, but the Jews were doing well. They were engaged in society. After those 70 years, there was a push to go back to Israel and to rebuild Jewish society. So rebuilding Jewish society had certain parts to it. First of all, Israel was desolate. Samaritans had taken over, and it was a slow rebuilding. Jews were doing well in Babylonia. Many of them didn't want to go. Didn't want to give up their lives. They give up their not give up their lives, but the lives they were leading, and go back to Israel, which was very much a wasteland. So tens of thousands, but not a lot of people went back, and they want to rebuild the temple. They needed to rebuild the structure of Jewish civilization. So a great leader from those days was named Ezra. Ezra is known as Ezra the scribe. He was literally a sofer, scribe. He was a Kohen. And he was a brilliant Torah scholar and leader. So he put together a group of leaders where there had been for tradition for many years, for over 1,000 years. For over 1,000 years, since Moses, there had been the great court, the Sanhedrin, which had 71 sages. He expanded the court to 120 sages. There is speculation that the reason he expanded the court to 120 sages is because he looked through the entire Jewish community and he found anyone who was truly accomplished in Torah and would be a worthy opinion, wanted them inside debating, not outside criticizing. And so it ended up with 120 rabbis, and they became known in history as the Anshe Knesset HaGedola, men of the Great Assembly. That's why there are 120 seats in the Knesset in Israel today, as far as I understand, because they were modeling themselves after the Knesset of the Gedola, the Great Knesset, and then they had a more a contemporary Knesset in their minds of the government, and they structured Jewish life it had been terrible decimation, its own Holocaust of the Babylonian Jewry, of Jewry in Israel by the Babylonians. And now they were rebuilding, and in rebuilding Jewish life, Ezra structured a lot of life, and the Anshe Knesset Agdol, the men of the Great Assembly, structured a lot of Jewish life for what we know now. There wasn't a structured prayer book. They made a structured prayer book. A lot of what we know today as bread and butter, structured Jewish life, came about through them because they took Torah mitzvahs and Torah values and Torah practices, and they made it more prescriptive so that we know exactly what to do, and did not leave it to a wish or assumption that people would know and they would consult and they would get it done right. So as I say, the prayers and the blessings, a lot of what we do that we have is structured by the men of the Great Assembly. So Ezra was, and the Talmud says it was like a Moses in his time. He was very, very. His impact on Jewish life until today really can't be overestimated. One of the things Ezra did was he instituted what's called Tevila. Tevila means an immersion. Ezra's immersion, and this is it's a well-known concept in Jewish law. The immersion of Ezra. Ezra, he stipulated a type of immersion relevant to what we're saying. So let's look at this. Nonetheless, Ezra the scribe, as part of the religious revival he had when the Jewish people returned to the land of Israel after the Babylonian exile, as I say, here it sounds from here like all the Jewish people went back. It was only a fraction, but I understand what, I didn't get into the history of it now. He decreed that men who have a seminal mission should immerse themselves before studying the Torah. And this enactment was eventually extended to include praying as well. So Ezra said that this idea, this is obviously rabbinic, he's taking a biblical idea where with a seminal mission, one couldn't go into the temple precincts or eat sacred foods. And now, when he did this was between temples, but they were going to build another temple when that would again be relevant. But he said, for posterity, it's not just going to be about eating sacred foods or going to temple precincts. It's going to be, as I mentioned before, there is this tinge of, and there's so much of Jewish life is about finding, helping people or encouraging people to find a balance between, different values. And that's very difficult what we have in life. We want this, but sometimes we do it at the expense of this. Balancing between values is a big part of our struggle. So here we want Judaism. We want marriages. The Torah encourages that there be the physical bond and physical intimacy between a husband and wife. It's considered an important thing. It's considered a mitzvah. It's part of the ketubah. At the same time, we don't want, since there can be a more self-gratifying, self-indulgent element to that, we don't want people to overdo that and become either to objectify the other or to just come focused on that pleasure of it. You want these things to be with balance. And as I say, that's a big struggle. So Ezra said, not only will it be in approaching temple precincts, eating sacred foods, one shouldn't study Torah after having marital intimacy before going to the mikveh. And since every Jew is going to want to study Torah, then they will, first of all, to go to the mikveh, and maybe that will temper a little bit, and there isn't this overdone of the self-indulgence in that area. So he decreed that men who have a seminal mission should immerse themselves before studying the Torah. And this enactment was eventually extended to include praying as well. I mean, so it was like a real deal. So last night, the husband and wife were able to cohabit, which is a beautiful thing. It's the morning, to daven, to study, to go up to the mikveh, but it would also, there was a price tag. to the cohabitation, realize that they have to do something. So in other words, to be able to have a check to the drive, so we know that it's not just carte blanche. Yes.
So I know, like, when a woman goes to a mikvah, there's a little bit of secrecy isn't the right word, but you're not like marching. There's a little bit of what's the word?
A lot of
Just being subtle about it. Privacy, because it's kind of it's announcing. It makes people aware of a certain time in their couple's lives. So now I'm thinking is that for men who do go to the mikvah regularly, they do so usually daily, partially because then it doesn't reveal like what oh, today I need to go, yesterday I didn't need to go, like, because that also would reveal some privacy. I think
that's a really good point. I grew up, and as we're going to see, I grew up in a community where going to the mikveh every day was a norm, and not in West Orange, but in the Chabad world. So no one knew anything. If there was, it was not. It was only after that. You're right. You'd be announcing a very private part of your life. That would be a little creepy. So I don't know exactly how it worked in the times of Ezra. I don't think that we wanted to be broadcast. I would think though that probably was the ability, they were living in a much more natural world. So going swimming in the river, wasn't going to be such a big deal. So a person would subtly go out, go for a swim. That could have been. It's a great question, Debbie. I don't believe that it was ever set up in society where people are, knocking the door. Can you open the mikveh for me? Yeah. Don't ask me why. I need it today. That's not going to work. But there must have been more subtle ways of going about it. I never thought of that. I don't know what the answer is. I can be certain that the subtlety that we want in women's mikveh would definitely want to be here. My guess is that it was just, it wasn't as much a big deal. We build mikvahs and you have to make an appointment. I think there probably was much more access to natural bodies of water, and they would just dunk. But good point. It's a question with a history question that I have. Again, I never thought about it. I've never seen it. Okay. But good question.
So clearly they figured out, or like I think you were saying, they just go daily. So then, like, it's not like you can't go if you didn't have relations.
Oh, no.
So then if you just go daily, then it won't stand out. Yeah, the time you had to go. I don't know.
Right. So if we were talking about it now, like in the Hasidic community, I'd say it's not a question. Everybody goes every day. But clearly it wasn't like that then. It transitioned to that. So I think the question is a very well-placed question. I just don't have the answer to what went on. But I can be pretty sure that it wasn't, it didn't mean that there was such a broadcasting of someone's private life. That's just runs counter to the way we think.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Point. Okay. Inconvenience of having to immerse themselves the following morning was intended to prevent the men from overindulging in marital relations, thereby enabling them to devote more time and energy to the study of Torah. So, because again, the balance, and we find it in the Talmud. There's a time, and even there's quality time that we have to spend, and it's a responsibility. It's in the ketubah, and there's a minimum to it. And the Talmud goes through different types of jobs, and what can be expected, as far as per week or per month. At the same time, as much as we say that's important, overindulgence is not important. It's not a good thing. So he wanted as a temper, a little bit of a check. However, this decree never acquired the force of law, even though it was Ezra, and that's just a big deal. And as I say, this idea of Tevilas Ezra, the immersion of Ezra, is a concept that's still spoken about and addressed in Jewish law. It never became an obligation. Why not? since it proved beyond the ability of the majority of the community to fulfill it, and it in fact proved counterproductive, preventing the men from studying the Torah when their others would have, or engaging in marital relations when they otherwise should have. So even though it was a respected thing, and it certainly was done, but it never, the rabbis never saw it as something, making it an official rabbinic enactment law, because they saw that what would happen sometimes is that they weren't studying Torah today because they couldn't find the mikveh. That's not what Ezra had in mind. Or they say, something, I love you, but I'm not going to be able to find the mikveh tomorrow. So no, that's not what Ezra had in mind either. So it really didn't have the productive outlet on a broad scale the way Ezra intended. So it is still a value in Torah. It's still a value which people in throughout the world, I'm not saying the majority, I have no idea. That's Debbie's point. I have no way of knowing, but nor should anyone know. But it is practiced, but it never became a law, because for the community, it wasn't seen as that something that was always going to be a constructive law. Nevertheless, pious individuals who were able to fulfill their obligations in both areas did observe Ezra's enactment, continue to do so to the present day. So you can imagine in Lakewood, in Borough Park or Williamsburg for sure, because Chassidim go every day. But even I would imagine that this still goes on, because there are open mikvahs there, and it's not so out of the idea of someone going to the mikvah is not out of the question. It could be a very special day, it could be their birthday, whatever it is. So it's not necessarily broadcasting it today, I don't think. But I'm not living in that community. The founders of the Hasidic movement in particular instructed their followers to adhere to this practice. So first, the Hasidic Rebbe said, do the Ezra immersion, which means in times it was necessary. Furthermore, from very early on in the Hasidic movement, it became common practice for men to immerse themselves every morning before prayers, regardless of whether they had a seminal mission for reasons of spiritual purity and renewed innocence before approaching God in prayer and engaging in the service through the day. So this was, they bring this as a closer look, just I guess for our Jewish fun facts. This is because the Torah did say that after seminal mission, there is a need for mikveh for engaging the holy objects or holy articles or holy ground. So today we do it anyway. We go to the mikveh, and it really depends on where you live and how possible it is. But all things being equal, at least in the Hasidic world, everybody goes to the mikveh every day. Okay. All the men. Now we're going to go through to menstruation, and here, this is still practical in the cycle of what we call family purity for women who are menstruating. But the way we do it is not the way the Torah lays it out. It goes beyond that. I mean, we never do less. But let's take a look at what the Torah says. 19. Just as men contract ritual defilement from both normal and abnormal discharges from their reproductive organ, because we said semen, but then there was something else we spoke about, which is called a zav. It's like an unhealthy flow, in a natural flow, maybe something like gonorrhea. But so there's the natural flow, semen, which is it's fine, but there is this need for mikveh. And then the Torah says an unnatural flow. It's also even more really the idea of needing the mikveh and purification. Well, that applies to women too. Women also contract ritual defilement for both normal and abnormal discharges from the reproductive organ, and that's what I was talking about in the beginning. There's this thing of things that we discharge, things that the body puts out. There is sometimes on the more like the idea of how we see it societally, that it's quote unquote dirty, so you can't daven in front of excrement or urine. And here there's this self-indulgent, but whatever the case is, women also have this idea when it comes to both normal and abnormal discharges from the reproductive organ, meaning menstrual blood and non-menstrual blood, respectively. That's what we're going to talk about now. There's such a thing as menstrual blood. There's something as non-menstrual blood that could be coming out of the same area. Whereas for men, normal and abnormal discharges are differentiated by the color and consistency of the discharge. For women, normal and abnormal discharges are distinguished solely by the date at which they occur as follows. So they wrote this. I'm not sure exactly why they use this wording, but I would say that from the Talmud, it seems quite clear that there was a time when women were able to see within their blood whether it was menstrual blood or non-menstrual blood. They were able to see there was difference in shades and in the experience, perhaps, and how they felt. That doesn't, I'm understanding that's no longer possible, except calendrically. But otherwise, blood is blood. But so I'm not sure why they wrote that. Where by men it's differentiated by color and consistency, and women are distinguished only by the date. Today, yes, but not in times of the Talmud, which is part of what we're doing here. Starting from the first time in her life that she begins menstruating, a woman begins a somewhat elastic style, alternating 7-day menstrual periods and 11-day non-menstrual time spans. So the way the Torah sees the calendar, women know themselves, say there's a period of time that there's going to be this menstrual flow, it's a monthly flow. And that we allot the 7 days for that. That's going to be, you won't necessarily go for 7 days, but it's a 7-day, that period of time is, whatever comes out is considered menstrual. After 7 days, there's another 11-day period. So it's altogether an 18-day chunk. That 11-day period is post-menstrual. If it's post-menstrual, then the blood that comes out is not menstrual. What kind of blood is it? Post-menstrual. Those bloods have different laws attached to them. So let's go a little further. Menstruation is considered to last exactly 7 days, even if actual bleeding occurs for fewer or more days. During the 11-day spans, whatever uterine bleeding may occur is considered non-menstrual. Although every 7-day menstrual period is immediately followed by an 11-day non-menstrual span, the 7-day menstrual period following an 11-day menstrual span does not begin until actual bleeding occurs. So it's day one of that 7th thing. It's the menstrual time, but until bleeding, there's nothing. But I know, knowing the cycle, today was the 1st of 7. Once the bleeding starts, then it is activated, but it's only a 7-day period. To illustrate, a woman's first 7-day menstrual period begins with the onset of her menarche. As soon as these 7 days are over, she begins counting again. Any bleeding that occurs during the ensuing 11 days is considered non-menstrual. If she does not bleed during this 11 days, or bleeds no more than 2 of them consecutively, she begins her next 7-day menstrual period the next time she starts bleeding, no matter when this occurs. So if bleeding comes during those 11 days, and it's 1 or 2 days, we're going to deal with that soon, but that's not menstrual. And after 11 days, whenever it happens, whenever bleeding happens, that's when the next cycle is. After the 2nd-day menstrual period, she counts 11 days again for menstrual bleeding, and so on. If, however, during an 11-day non-menstrual span, she bleeds for 3 or more consecutive days, so now she's in the 11-day non-menstrual spot, but she's 3 or more days. So what's that? Her next 7-day menstrual period is postponed until after she has ceased bleeding and then counted 7 full consecutive days clear of bleeding, as will be explained later. Then there is something, her cycle is seen as being off. Maybe this is, it's not considered menstruant, but there is something off. So we need a buffer between that and her next menstrual period. So the bleeding has to stop, and then she has to have 7 clear days. And then we say that now it's and after that, the next time she bleeds, that's a 7 days. So in other words, it seems like a hangover of the menstruation, or not That's a Talmudic debate. After which she again counts 11 days menstrual bleeding, and so on. If the woman bleeds in the last 2 days of the 11-day non-menstrual span and then continues to bleed one or more of the subsequent days, I guess let's take it further to 116. These subsequent days of bleeding do not combine with the 2 days of non-menstrual bleeding. If I don't know if you're keeping count on this, but if she does on the last 2 days of the 11-day non-menstrual span and then continues to bleed past it, these subsequent bleeds do not combine with the 2 days of non-menstrual bleeding to form a 3 more day period, because those 11 days are a unit of non-menstrual bleeding that must be followed by a 7-day count of clear days. Rather, the subsequent bleeding begins her second menstrual period. We will first discuss the ritual defilement that a person contracts from menstrual bleeding. So there are going to be a few things. How we deal with menstrual bleeding, how we deal with bleeding of 1 or 2 days within the 11-day period, and how we deal with 3 days or more days within the 11-day period. 3 different sections. One's called a nida, which is the normal menstruation. One is called a zava, but a zava is that there's a flow. Male was zav, that's the unnatural flow. This is an unnatural flow of blood, and it's called a zava, but it's a zava katana, like a small zav. A ziva katana is only 1 or 2 days. Or there's a zava gedola, which means a larger one, that the blood was 3 or more days in non-menstrual time. Okay, let's just finish off the English, the left side of 116. If a woman has uterine discharge and her discharge based on the day it begins is deemed to be menstrual blood, she becomes ritually defiled, as will be described presently. In order not to ritually defile other people or implements, she must refrain from touching them or letting them touch her. She must remain in her state of separation from contact for exactly 7 days, regardless of how long her flow actually lasts. If her discharge has ceased by the end of the 7th day of her menstruation period, she may immerse herself the following evening and thus become rid of this defilement. During her period of separation, all touches will become ritually defiled, must immerse themselves in the mikveh, after which they will remain defiled until evening, at which time they will become rid of this defilement. And we said this with the man also, anything he touched, he sat on, whatever clothing would need, mikveh. Okay. Let's go to a closer look, which will bring us into the present day, because this is not practiced anymore. On the right side, 19. Alternating 7-day menstrual periods and 11-day non-menstrual time spans. Inasmuch as in this context, there is no empirical difference between menstrual and non-menstrual blood. The sole factor in determining whether blood is menstrual or non-menstrual being the day in which the bleeding occurs. Again, they're talking about in today's day, women cannot tell the difference, or no one can tell the difference. So therefore, but at one point there was, women were able to deal with, to keep track of all this. But in today, since there's no empirical difference between one type of blood or another, it's quite easy to lose track of the count, mistake one type of blood for the other. You really, this takes an amount of focus, which is kind of unreasonable to expect from people. Furthermore, as we will see, the Torah forbids marital relations when the wife has been ritually defiled by either menstrual or non-menstrual bleeding. So the laws of this type of ritual defilement are just as pertinent when the temple is standing as when it is not standing as when it is. Here, it's not about us only going to temple precincts or eating sacred foods. We're not allowed to cohabit when there's the bleeding. We need to know what's going on. For this reason, in the 2nd century, after the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Yehuda Prince, who was the redactor of the Mishnah, he created the structure of the Talmud. In the wake of the upheavals accompanying the destruction of the Second Temple and the resultant diaspora of the Jewish people, he set up one system, which is still not the system, but he decreed that whenever a woman bleeds for either 1 day or 2 consecutive days, even though in the Torah it says that she just has to go to the mikveh and then she's fine. It says she should count 6 clear days before immersing herself. She has to wait. She has to see what this is, because maybe this is part of Anita. We can't trust that they're going to know it's the 11 days, because bleeding in the middle of 7 days, that's the whole 7 days are Anita. So we wanted to prevent mistakes. So they said, anytime there's blood, even whether it's 7 or 11, doesn't make a difference anymore. There's another 6 days before immersing herself. And whenever she bleeds 3 or more consecutive days, she should count 7 clear days before immersing herself. So it's 6 days. If it was only 1 or 2 days, then she's going to watch herself to make sure that, let's see if there's blood, it's still bleeding. If it was 3 or more days, then they finish and go another 7 days, because 3 or more days, it could be either Nida, or it could be the Ziva Gedola, a larger one. And even though after Nida, you don't need 7 clear days. If it was Ziva Gedola, you do need 7 clear days. So now we're going to play it safe. This way, there's no need to keep track of the 7 and 11 day spans. If she bleeds for 1 or 2 days, she is technically permitted to engage in marital relations either after the 2nd or 3rd day after she bled, if it was 1 or 2 days of non-menstrual bleeding, or after the 7th day after she began to bleed, if it was 1 or 2 days of menstrual bleeding. Thus, counting 6 clear days covers both possibilities. If, however, she bled for 3 more days, is what I said before, 3 days of bleeding might have been non-menstrual, she must therefore count 7 clear days to cover that possibility, because the Torah is more, it's as far as the counting and the clean days and the mikveh and so on, the Ziva Gedola, that 3 or more days in a non-natural time, in other words, 11-day period, is more restrictive than during the time of actual menstruation. So that was quite a bit, but it helped clear things up. However, the Jewish women of Rabbi Yehuda, the prince's time, he decreed this, but the women on their own at the time, and this is an important thing, and the Talmud makes it very clear, that the daughters of Israel took upon themselves a structure which they felt, so this is self-imposed, but it was, if it's self-imposed and accepted by the community, it's considered binding on future generations. So the Jewish women of Yehuda, the prince's time, took upon themselves to count 7 clear days after any duration of bleeding, even only 1 day. If there is bleeding, actual bleeding, then we check, and until make sure there's no blood. And when there's no blood, then we say, okay, now the bleeding has stopped, and there's another 7 days. The Torah doesn't say to do that, but we're not sure. They want to make sure that it's, maybe I didn't notice that yesterday, maybe it's after 3 days. Just they wanted to have a one-size-fits-all rule so that we don't get tripped up by the nuances. In order that there be only one rule for all cases, this additional stringency was approved of by the legal authorities at the time and became fixed as Jewish law to this day. So this is considered Jewish law to this day, binding Jewish law to this day, and it's actually, it's not so much, it's self-created Jewish law. It's a Jewish law that Jewish women of the time decreed upon themselves, and it's therefore binding for future generations. This next, the Hasidic insights, I don't think we're going to be able to finish it today. I think it's a little early, but I think it's wiser for us to stop this here. If you have questions, that's fine. If not, so that we can dive into the Hasidic insights on 19 next time, and deal with it properly, not have to interrupt, because it's its own thing. I don't think we're going to be able to. It's too much of a mouthful, I think, to be able to get done today.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's above my pay scale this time, but
This is complicated stuff.
no, it's not something I've ever experienced. So. But
Thank you.
yeah.
Right, we'll record it for the mikvah grand opening. Just kidding. All right.
Okay,
Have a good one. Thank you.
Bye-bye.